Hello, welcome to this video. This video is going to be called The History of Progressive Rock in 60 Albums Part 3. The Golden Age of Progressive Rock. Right, we're up to 1970 in this history. Those who haven't watched the other videos, don't worry about it. What we've done so far is define what progressive rock is, so we know what we're talking about. And I've looked at some really important, influential albums on the development of progressive rock, leading up to In the Court of the Kings and Crimson King, by King Crimson in 1969. And that seems to, all the other bands that aren't quite sure what they're doing, like Yes and Genesis and all these other bands, they're like, they hear that and then they know what they're about to do. That album is so influential. And so 1970, I think, is the definite, the progressive rock genre is now established and we are now moving forward. Now what I'm going to do on these videos from now on is I'm going to pick an album from each year and I'm going to discuss that album in relation to what's going on at the time in progressive rock. And I'm hoping we can edge year by year through this history and hopefully get a different angle on how this history works. So, by 1970, we are now at the advent of the golden age of progressive rock. Okay, these albums are going to sell millions. You know, every kid is going to have these albums in their bedroom. They're all going to be rolling their little joints on the cover of their Dark Side of the Moon, and they're going to be getting stoned and having this experience that progressive rock is going to put into culture. That influence is still there, even though the powers that be trying to pat it down and say it's not. It is there. Right, so at number 70, things have not quite gelled. You know, the Yes are still to make the Yes album in 1971. So they're floundering around. They've got all the ingredients, but it's not quite come together. ELP have made their first album, and I think that's a definitive progressive rock album. But the album I'm going to throw in the mix for 1970 is actually Atom Heart Mother. Pink Floyd are a really interesting band, and as I do this channel, my respect for them is growing all the time. I think Pipe at the Gates of Dawn is just such an incredible album in terms of the development of this genre. But with the losing of Syd Barrett and that sort of very concise vision that he brought to the band, they're floundering about, being very, very experimental here, there and there and all that type of thing. I think by the time they get to 1970, especially side 1, which is Atom Heart Mother, that sidelong epic and the use of orchestral forms, the use of the orchestra, the use of improvisation, it's an absolute work of genius. This is a mainstream band with a mainstream album, and this album is far out, as they used to say back then. It's an incredible achievement, and I think this is a watershed in 1970. That album really must have shaken the foundations of what is going to be possible on an album. We're then going to get, you know, Tarkus by ELP, another sidelong epic, and then Yes are going to get their acting gear and they're going to do Close to the Edge. But I think Pink Floyd are leading the way. It's so much further out than anybody else at that time. It's so experimental, and it's not something that is just hidden away in the esoteric, you know, mists of progressive rock history. This is a mainstream album by one of the biggest bands in the world. So that's what I got at number 70, is Atom Heart Mother. At number 71, right, it's still, now you want to know how I've done this. I've used two sources. One is Wikipedia. And Wikipedia has a progressive rock timeline that runs through year by year, and I was able to see all the albums that they deemed as being progressive rock. I've also used Prog Archives, and they have a feature where you can pick a year and then it will pull up albums in sort of the critical and fan love of those albums. So I was a lot of cases where I could put, say, 1973 in, and you get a whole list of albums. You can see, oh, this is the ones that all the fans like, this is the ones that the critics like, and it will order that, and that was very useful for me. In 1971, there's a whole host of really incredible albums coming out. I think the in terms of progressive rock, the ones for me that are so very important would be Fragile and the Yes album, both coming out in 1971, and Nursery Crime by Genesis. But none of these bands, they're still not yet to hit their peak, right? And so one of the things that has become apparent in me trying to do this history, and it came up in the previous video when we talked about 1960s, is Prog holds its hands with jazz fusion. right? This channel is founded on two genres. It's jazz fusion and prog. I think in terms of instrumental virtuosity, jazz fusion has to happen. It's the ingredient that has to come in, and it changes the prog bands, right? It influences them. Of course, we know what we're talking about here. We're talking about the Mahavishnu Orchestra. And in 1971, the Mahavishnu Orchestra bring it out In a Mountain Flame. And looking at those lists for 1971, to me, from my viewpoint, I went, that's the groundbreaking album. That's the key album in 1971 that comes in and brings that instrumental virtuosity in. And when we go forward and we start to look at things like prog metal and math rock, and we also look at sort of the technical, virtuosity elements in certain musicians, that also, I think, is not has its roots in, but this album from 1971 is so important. So at 1971, I have In a Mountain Flame by the Mahavishnu Orchestra, bringing in the fusion, bringing in the virtuosity, bringing in the odd time signatures, and bringing in the sort of speed guitar playing, Right, so let's move on to 1972. When you put 1972 in, you're then basically, at this point, you're looking at prog masterpieces. There's millions and millions of them. The one I'm going to go for is the one that's behind my head. This is possibly the summit of prog, right? We've been building up from Freak Out with Frank Zappa in 1965. Things are moving, they're getting bigger and bigger. And in 1972, we have the summit of prog. It's the biggest genre on the planet, We're going to have a couple of albums that are going to sell millions and millions, and these are heavy albums. So yeah, and not for 1972, I'm going to represent it with Close to the Edge, the near perfect album by Yes. In so many polls, this comes out as the greatest progressive rock album of all time. But you know what other albums we have at this time? We have Foxtrot by Genesis. We've got Thick as a Brick by Jethro Tull. We've got Three Friends by Gentle Giant. We've got Trilogy by ELP, all utter masterpieces. So at this point, prog rules the world. Why has this happened? I think a lot of it has got to do with the fact that the album at that point is the most sophisticated art form that you can bring into your home. You can buy a book. You can switch your television on and peer into that little screen with your mono sound, and you can watch, whatever you would be watching here in the UK. Probably Are You Being Served, In America, I don't know what it would be. And you've got these entertainment things that you can bring in. You've got the radio. But suddenly we have the advent of stereo sound. Big sound systems. People can buy a vinyl album, they can put it on, and they can fill their whole room up with this enveloping experience. At that point, you want more than a 3-minute song. You want something that's going to blow your mind. Right? And so this is why I think these albums emerge. People are after experience. It's almost like a filmic experience. And this is why something like Close to the Edge sells millions. People want to sit down and have that 20-minute experience of going on the journey of Close to the Edge. This makes prog absolutely important. The public wanted it. It wasn't like it was forced upon them and then punk came along and showed them what they really wanted. No, this is what they wanted. In terms of punk's record sales, they're dwarfed compared to the sales that prog is now having in 1972. And I put Close to the Edge. By 1973, we're still riding the wave, and the album I've got to represent that is one of the biggest selling albums in rock music history, which is Dark Side of the Moon. Again, pushing that experience even further out, and the use of sort of that three-dimensional imaging that happens on the albums where things sort of sound like they're almost outside the speakers. People are buying an experience, right? There's a whole other host of albums coming out at this time, classic albums. Lark's Tongues in Aspic by King Crimson. King Crimson 1973. I think that album's sort of 72 as well. I might have got my facts wrong there. But, I think Lark's Tongues in Aspic is pointing to the shift that's going to change prog. I think the prog musicians themselves, definitely Robert Thripp by 1973, know this is up. I don't think that the idea that punk came along and showed those musicians that they were doing wrong is correct. Compiling this list, I think when you look at what's going on in prog, there seems to be a crisis happening before that, and I think it's represented by Lark's Tongues in Aspic. Lark's Tongues in Aspic by King Crimson is a prog album, but it's different. It's darker and heavier and starker, and it's not trying to envelope you in this symphonic beauty. It's challenging you in another way. There's another element coming out which is much more starker and angular and weird. But 73, we also see Tales from Topographic Oceans, which I think is, yes, really probably doing the most progressive rock album of all time. You know, Tubular Bells comes out, you know, becoming another multi-million-pound seller. And in Europe, we have Magma with the Mechanic album, MDK, that album, which I think is, I'm not a huge expert on Magma, but I think is possibly their masterpiece. All coming out in 73. So 72, 73, prog is its absolute peak, artistically but commercially. And we're seeing albums coming out that are selling in the millions. And some of these albums are the biggest selling albums in history. Right? Then when you go to 1974 and you look at the progressive rock albums there, it's suddenly they've disappeared. The classics have gone. Right? 74, there's a shift. The album I've pulled up in 74 to represent that year is Red by King Crimson, which is the last of the trilogy of the sort of second coming of King Crimson, the Bill Bruford, John Wetton period. And Red is dark. This is going to influence like bands like Nirvana as much as it's going to influence prog. The prog musicians knew that something had happened. Genesis in 74 made Lamb Lies Down. I nearly put that in there. And again, that's Genesis turning away from that sort of English aesthetic and looking to America, looking to like R&B and soul influences. We know where Gabriel's going to go. Also, You by Gong, which I think is a pretty important album. But of course, that's looking towards way off into the future, almost towards like trippy dance music, you know. So actually, all the prog classics, the real big prog classics, have all happened in 72, 73. By 1974 and 1975, there's a dearth. I'm like looking around for the classic prog albums. I just thought they'd be there. I thought that we would be running up to right 66, 76, 77. Then punk came along. But it's not. Prog has almost realised its own doom. It's questioning itself already at this point. Right? There's albums there, but there's nothing to compare with The Close to the Edge or Foxtrot or Thick as a Brick or Three Friends or Dark Side of the Moon or Tubular Bells. That's all done by 73. There's a hole going on. By 1975, the only album I could really pull out, and I really was searching, there's a huge album of that year, and it's Wish You Were Here by Pink Floyd, and that's the album that I'm going to put in. Pink Floyd just sit there churning, you know, great albums out over and over again. But Wish You Were Here is completely like Piper at the Gates of Dawn. The title Piper at the Gates of Dawn is a title looking to the future. Wish You Were Here is looking to the past. Wish You Were Here is the thing you write on the bottom of your postcard when you go on your seaside holiday. And English seasides, which is an aesthetic all of its own, and we're going to be dealing with that later on, believe me. The English seaside aesthetic will be talked about later on. But it's a shabby aesthetic. It's people enjoying themselves, but it's a shabby enjoyment which has allusions to a sort of richer past. You know, all these seaside towns you were always told, in the Victorian times, that all the rich would come to this town, and then you look at it and you see all your sticks of rock and, you know, the little hats and Kiss Me Quick on, and that whole aesthetic. And it's a lament. So my argument here is prog is already questioning itself before punk comes along. Right? It's already in a crisis. Okay? And what's interesting is at this point, 1975, I think the musicians are looking themselves already for a different approach. How do we take progressive rock forward? Well, there's a number of ways of doing that. In 1976, the album I'm going to put together to represent that year, which is pre-punk, remember, this pre-punk has not emerged, especially in America, enough to have an influence, is 2112 by Rush. Now, what Rush do here, and this is, I think on the list, this is the first sort of non-British album to come on the list so far, yeah. Rush basically take that heavy rock form and mix it with prog, and they have a massive success at this point. This is now opening up the doors to where heavy metal is going to take part of the mantle of prog. It gets grabbed by heavy metal at this point, and it gets taken on into the new wave of British heavy metal. And most new wave of British heavy metal bands like Angel Witch and Diamond Head, and especially, Iron Maiden, they're just dripping with prog. So we have to be aware that that's the package, and that's why I put the, Rush in there, because I think Rush are that joint between heavy rock and heavy metal and prog. And that's going to open up a line, and that's going to be featured on the albums that I'm covering in the future. Wish You Were Here is, from the year before, is like a lament. It's like saying goodbye to that. Rush have already done, are going to go on to do this on their follow-up album to 2112 with A Farewell to Kings. People are looking to the future. They're listening to new wave. They're listening to disco. These influences are coming in because prog has that in its DNA. The doors are open, like I said on the first video. The part thing what progressive rock does is it takes rock and roll and it opens itself up to what's going on. Right? What's interesting is that in 76, when punk emerges, right, how does that influence prog bands? Well, it's almost like they're almost revitalised by when punk comes in. And by 77, when you look, there's a whole bunch of actually very strong prog albums that are coming out by bands like, Pink Floyd and Genesis. And I think with Going for the One, with Yes, this is another career height. I think that Going for the One is one of their greatest albums. I think at side 2 with Wondrous Stories is perhaps the greatest short prog tune of all time, and Awaken is the greatest long prog tune of all time. And I think that side 2 of Going for the One, which sold millions, it sold way more than any punk albums that are coming up at this time, right? That side 2 of Going for the One is perhaps the greatest side of progressive rock in existence. That's the peak. So prog bands are not knocked out at this point, and they're still very successful. But I think the musicians themselves, being creative entities, are moving with the times. I can remember, reading an interview with Phil Collins that he said when punk came out, he didn't feel part of the prog club. He thought they were doing something else, and he was nodding along going, yeah, I agree with those guys. They're totally right. There's so much of this overblown music. I didn't realise that they were talking about him. Right? And I'm sure that was a perception. Certain bands like ELP weren't able to move to this new way of making music. And what's happened, because I don't think it's punk. I think the big change was that the popular music audience moved from album-orientated sort of rock music to disco. I think that's as much of a change. When we look at the history of jazz fusion, that's definitely what happens. Is all these fusion musicians are told to write a dance hit or get lost. And I'm sure that's the same thing. How do we wind this in? Punk lasts for about 6 months. Never Mind the Bollocks by Sex Pistols sells 1 million copies, which is nothing compared to what we've got going on here. And very quickly, it's changed. And what it does is it changes the nature of new bands emerging, and we get sort of new wave, which then turns into sort of electro pop, and it turns into new romanticism and a whole bunch of things, which are absolutely dripping with prog influences in there. I've talked about this on this channel. I think the influence of prog on post-punk bands is far greater than the influence of punk on prog bands. I think that everybody is just slowly changing. But of course, those punk bands are the critics' darlings, so they wanted to make out that punk had done this because it almost made out that they had changed this music. But of course they hadn't, right? So I washed my hair before this, and it's all gone a bit sort of strange today. But I think it's very good that I've got a strange haircut on this video because it will differentiate it from all my other videos. There we go. I can justify anything that happens. All right, so let's get off my hair, back on to the last few years of the 70s. So for 1978, I have got the first album by the band UK. It's an absolute prog masterpiece. I think there's a schism in that band when that's formed. Here we have a sort of super group: Alan Holdsworth, John Wetton, Eddie Jobson, and Bill Bruford. Bill Bruford and Alan Holdsworth, they're enthralled by jazz fusion and they want to pursue that improvisatory approach. But Eddie Jobson and John Wetton, they want to write prog music that is more concise. They want to draw it in. It's not punk influence at all, but they want to, the consideration of commerciality is there, and that creates a schism in UK, which resolves itself in Holdsworth and Bill Bruford just going totally towards fusion. And John Wetton going towards, AOR pop music. Okay. We also see with the album And Then There Were Three by Genesis, we see them drawing in, right? I don't think this is punk doing this. I think this is just the natural cultural shift that's happening in. But they're still making progressive rock albums. UK is an out-and-out progressive rock album, and Then There Were Three was a pretty prog influenced pop album. That's what's going on at this point by the late 70s. But the album that I may well put in, I was going to put the UK album. I'm not. The album I'm going to put in here for 1978. I'm going to put possibly the first prog album I ever heard, and the only prog album that my parents ever bought, which is The War of the Worlds by Jeff Wayne in 1978. I'm going to put it in because that was one of the biggest albums culturally. Right, everybody had that. Every family had that. War of the Worlds has not got one drip of punk on it. It's an out-and-out prog album that was #1 in the charts here in the UK. Right, everybody bought into this. And what's interesting with the War of the Worlds, it's an out-and-out prog album, without a doubt. It tells the story of the H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds through a double album of conceptually, continuous, orchestral influence prog rock. It's a big prog rock album, right? But the thing that makes a difference is it's got that little hint of an influence from disco, right? I think this is far more important. Pop music had changed. Disco came in, and disco was frivolous. It was the thing that rock and roll was. It's the hedonist, visceral part of rock and roll emerging. Punk isn't. Punk's intellectual. Punk shares so much with prog. It just doesn't share the instrumental virtuosity. But a lot of those musicians had that instrumental virtuosity. It's there in the Stranglers. It's there with the Clash. This story of punk coming in is not the case, right? And I think as we get to the 80s, I can show you that. But here we have 1978. After punk, we have War of the Worlds, one of the biggest prog albums in history in terms of my country. And in 1979, the album I'm going to put through, which is not an album I like, but I think it's so important to put it here, is the huge double conceptual album The Wall by Pink Floyd, which spawned their #1 hit record around the world, We Don't Need No Education. And that there, what are we talking about? Yeah, there is a hole in this prog history, but it's before punk. 74, 75, there's a hole of these prog bands. Now, think of what they're going to do next, but in terms of Genesis, in terms of Yes, in terms of Pink Floyd, they reconvene with some of the biggest albums in their career. Prog soldiers on. It changes. It does draw itself in. It stops doing the sidelong epics. But this is still the slow march of the history of progressive rock. And as we go into the 80s, we see a shattering of these ideas as this influence then can be seen in the new wave of British heavy metal. We can see the influence of prog through new wave music into electro, into new romanticism. Bands like ABC, which are produced by Trevor Horn, is the ex-singer of Yes, right? This is not post-punk music. This is very high concept, showy, arty pop music, which has got a great dose of prog. Is it prog? No. But the influences is there. So my argument is that actually what happens with the history of prog is we have this emergence, we have this huge commercial peak around about 72, 73. Then the bands are thinking, what do we do with this? And other artists are coming through and they've heard these bands. People like Kate Bush and all these artists that come out and become huge pop stars. The influence of prog is in pop in the 80s. The influence of prog is in metal in the 80s. It's going to influence dance music. It's going to influence hip hop. It's the tendency to want to take a visceral, hedonistic form that is popular with the masses and then expand on this and make it intellectually and musically more advanced. These ideas are developed in the history of progressive rock. We start off in 1970 with Atom Heart Mother by Pink Floyd. Really dense, musically advanced, difficult album. We end in 79 by The Wall with Pink Floyd and the hit single, Another Brick in the Wall. We don't need no education. Right? Prog is still there. Anyone who would objectively sit back and go, oh, look at this band, they have this weird album in 1970 which is very influential. By 79 they've hit a peak and they got one of the biggest albums in history. So that genre seemed to do pretty well. None of this, it was killed off in 1977 by some punk bands. No, it didn't happen. And as we go into the next video and look at the 1980s, hopefully I can establish the fact that that is not the case. And we can start to see not only the wider influences of prog, but we could actually see some hardcore prog bands in the 1980s that are pushing the envelope of what progressive rock is. So I'm going to be doing that on the next video. So if you enjoyed this video, which was part 3 of my 60 albums, an history of progressive rock in 60 albums. If you enjoyed that and you want to see the next one, then obviously subscribe and ring the notification bell. If you want to support me doing what I'm doing, and please support me because I'm freezing cold in this room. This is not part of my house. I'm actually in my studio. There's no heater in there, which is why I'm on the scarf, and it's absolutely freezing today. And I'm going to have to keep going, but I'm freezing cold. So if you want to, help me get a nice little heater in here, a quiet one. I have got a heater, but if I put it on and make too much noise, and then the fans of this channel will be going, what's that sound in the background? It's my heater there. So I might have to go and get it now and just warm this place up for a little bit before I get on to the next video, which I'm about to film now, which is the 1980s. I haven't got a title for that video. I'm going to have to go and think one. So I'm going to go and get my heater. I'm going to think of a title for this next video, and I hopefully will see you on it. Thanks for watching, and I hope you're enjoying this. And we're getting close to Christmas now, and so hopefully this series will take you right up to Christmas, and then we'll have a Christmas treat on Christmas Day for you. That's something to look forward to. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon. Bye.